They're likely to have come from ministerial bungalows and their kith and kin. And that is really where real crime dwells, and we don't even touch it. The Yadav gangs and the manner in which they ran the show, they came to dominate the police and the administrative machinery, that really was crime and organized crime. But what we are witnessing in these slums, to my mind, is not crime, but conflict. And I think the two really have to be really seriously separated. Now, the other kind where crime comes in is where we all know most slums are on wasted land and illegal, and therefore residents are subject to extortionist mafias, especially the police. So there'll be all kinds of, now that would be routine institutionalized crime, because they would have their touts who would be collecting money on a regular basis. And so in the slum dwellers, while might occasionally exchange abuses and blows and break each other's heads over conflict over scarce resources, but what we are ignoring is the web of illegality under which they are surviving. Their water connection is likely to be illegal, their power connection is likely to be illegal, their slum, wherever they build that little jhuggi, they're likely to be paying some slum lords and the police. That organized crime by agents of the state in collaboration with political goons, because they are likely to be politically patronized, and living under the shadow of that organized crime, I think is the real study, and the impact of it on individual psyches, what it does to you, the amount of incomes that are being siphoned off daily, what do you earn and what do you end up giving as hafta to this one and that one, and what it does to your self-esteem, and what it means especially for women. While you talk about domestic violence, but anyone who has cursory knowledge of slums would know that much more than even domestic violence, what women fear is the police, sexual exploitation by the police and local goons, politically patronized goons, and which is why a lot of women would rather live under the shadow or under the protection, so-called, of even an abusive husband, because then they say, I take beating from one man. But if I live alone and I say, hell with you, then there are too many of them waiting to prowl on me. And I think that, to my mind, is the real dimension of criminality, which needs to be looked at very carefully. Because, it's already been commented that India does not fit into the high category crime rate countries or cities. Very low, especially considering the levels of poverty in India. It humbles me how few people take to crime. It humbles me why they don't take knives and shove into people who are harassing them morning, evening and night, whether as vendors or as rickshaw pullers, or when they want to go about their... it's humbling, in fact. How often you hear the police, ordinary poor people say, they're harassing me, but I'm not going to turn into a criminal just because they won't let me put up my little banana stall here and they're harassing me and they're taking away my goods. I insist on earning my living by hard work. And it also humbles me how the very poor people who come to work in our house, and thank you there for pointing out the connection you said between the rich and the poor. And that connection stays because the poor come into well-off houses and still don't steal. I rarely have to lock up my, I don't hesitate to give the keys of my house to the woman who comes to do jharu pocha, but I would be very afraid to give it to the local police station. I really mean it. So the crime rate is truly, and one possible explanation for it could be, and this is something we need to explore, is the relative greater stability of family life, even among the poor, and community life. The poor don't live atomized existence. If it's a Musahar colony, then they're living with fellow Musahars, and the respect of their fellow biradari, caste, kinship group matters a lot. And that keeps people more than the fear of police or the fear of laws or the fear of jails. It's the izzat, having being respected among your community, which keeps people away from crime and have some fallback. To my mind, it's communities where families break down and atomized, people become atomized, that crime rates shoot up because the social restraints are lacking. And finally, this business about domestic violence increase. I mean, it appears as if, though, mind you, the paper doesn't indicate that other crimes have fallen. It's just better targeting at slums or whatever. I'm not even clear what kind. I would like a deeper discussion on that at some point with the authors. But it looks like because people can't get away by beating their neighbors, so they say, all right, let me now beat my wife. Now, is it the argument, when you say it's a perception that people shared, are they saying that people have begun taking their frustration out on wives because they can't take it out on others, and therefore she's an easy target? Or is it that women are now relatively less reluctant to approach the police station for a complaint? And Uday, you're right, underreporting is a serious problem. So we better not take all the figures or any of the figures seriously. You know it better than me, and you said it better than me. But the fact that, again, due to the perception of Nitish Kumar wanting better law and order, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But if that perception has percolated down, then maybe more women are walking up to the thana when they are getting beaten and asking for the case to be registered than before. I mean, is that likely to be the case? Or maybe even media, because in the last few years there's been increasing propagation over media that crimes against women are bad and you can go and register, etc. I don't know which one it is, but possibly better registration of domestic violence crime than the fact that they've increased. It just doesn't, to my mind, there seems no logical connection, unless, as I said, people think that you beat your biwi, your wife, you can get away with it, but other things you can't. Thank you.
The final observation. Thank you, sir, for permitting me to speak again. Danish, to reiterate the point that beautifully again has been made by the lady there, is to develop the definitions of the concept that you have undertaken. For example, you are interchangeably using many of the terms, and end of it, we are not very sure what exactly you mean by violence, crime. Like professionally, within policing, we are made to learn the difference between, say, deviance, which is also a subject of, study in sociology, then offense, then crime, then law and order, and then public order. And there are layers upon layers upon layers, and there are dilemma when you are confronted with a public order situation. You really give a hood to deviance or the offense. And there are situations, this kind of situations do arise for any law enforcing agency. So you need to be clear what exactly you are hinting at when you are talking about violence, which is a very generic term, and when you are talking about crime, which is a very technical term. The draft that I have seen doesn't elaborate at all. And if you do that, it will make it a little more analytical. One. The second is the point that has been beautifully pointed out now. I would say the legitimacy given to violence by the state. Not to say that the local interconnections between the police and the crime doesn't exist. But police is not on its own state. State is a larger entity. I need not explain that. There was a regime where the state gave some kind of unwritten license to happening of crime, which also led to law and order many a times, public order at times. Now that kind of situation was quite alarming, and that led to a perception that it's a crime capital of India. Now that crime capital of India is a subjective construct of the mind coming out of a journalistic pen. But it does speak about a feeling amongst people of helplessness, that when you know that it is coming out of the CM's office and your son has been abducted, where do you go? So, not that people today walk into police station, automatically the case is registered. But there is a happy situation that at least people have the faith to walk into a police station. As against a situation where they thought instead of police station, might as well go to CM office, which was rather bizarre. And therefore, drawing a oversimplified picture of 90 to 2005 on the one hand, vis-a-vis what is happening today for the last 6-7 years, one would get into little complexity of the situation and talk about the normative order and the existential order. The normative order talked about norms, and the existential order is in the ground. Today also there are crime, but it doesn't get a backing of the state as it enjoyed at a particular point of time. This is what.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Just a small point that I dare say that the next draft won't have crime capital of India in the title, but I would draw attention to the fact that the focus was on violence. So I think that the paper itself and the presentation were fairly specific about the small slice of crime and experience of urban life that we are researching. And I think it's great that there's been a wider debate, but to me that sounds like about, 5 or 6 other research studies, which it'd be great to see, but I don't think that Shivani and Dennis have done those. And so I think that, I'd say a slightly more specific focus on exactly what the study did do. And it's great that we identify other things to do in terms of political economy of long-term violence trends in Bihar or Patna, but I think that wasn't the focus of this piece of research. Quickly.
Perception is not a bad word. In fact, perceptions are the basis of how we understand the world. Every single bit of information in a survey, quantitative, is a perception. And in fact, I would actually put to you, Alec, that surveys have probably got more propensity for errors than kind of intensive, interactive qualitative exchange. So I think there's one gets into talks about the politics of representation and the politics of kind of talking. I mean, it's very easy and it sounds very authoritative to actually throw out figures, and we have lots of figures, but in some ways the figures that we have I find are meaningless without proper contextualization. And I think this is where what we have tried to do in this study is a mixed method study. We've combined intensive qualitative research with, I think, as far as I know, it is one of the most robust quantitative surveys of slums in Patna that I have come across, at any rate. I wanted to pick up just quickly in order a few things. I completely agree that it would be wonderful if we could have done studies of middle class and upper class, and that in some ways would be the next stage of research, next project. Let's go and find some more funding and sort of do that. There is a limitation. We were a team of 3.5, shall we say, in Patna. One person came in half the time, and there's only so much we could do. But I do agree that I think it would be very interesting to have that and look at kind of the way in which the upper class and the elite of Patna are actually living and understand violence. I mean, on a very anecdotal basis of some of the elites of Patna whom I've met with and so on, they all think Patna is a much safer city now. They think violence has declined and gone down. The interesting thing is that contrasts with the perceptions of people in the slum. The thing about the idea of the phases of research, I guess. I mean, what we were doing, we were doing kind of the research was phased, and we weren't necessarily the idea of the trade-offs and so on. It's something which came out. I mean, we weren't necessarily thinking it was a trade-off. It's trying to understand and interpret the information that we came across. People in the slums were very much associated that, you know, there used to be a lot of gang violence. It didn't affect the poor that much, although it was based in the slums. It came out of the slums because all over the world, slums are actually wonderful areas for organized crime to hide in. You know, if you're living in the chief minister's bungalow and you're an organized criminal, then it's very easy to find you. Whilst if you're kind of in a slum, and I know it's not always like that, but it is often like that. So I think so people were saying, but that's gone down, that's disappeared. The gundas who are harassing us, whom we feared, have disappeared. But that doesn't mean that violence has disappeared. And actually, people themselves say that domestic violence has gone up. I want to pick up two other things. One is I completely concede the inclusion of poverty reduction in the title, the general project title, is misleading. Put it down to reading what the terms of reference of the grant application were and sort of deciding to put poverty reduction in it. Having said that, I do think that actually violence and tackling violence, poverty doesn't cause violence, but it is related to violence. So any kind of violence-reducing initiative or any initiatives which want to tackle violence will have an impact on poverty. And that, I think, is something which needs to be sort of looked at. Our case study of Patna, I concede that we are only looking at slums. However, according to the Patna Municipal Corporation, 72% of Patna is slums. So perhaps we can retitle our study a case study of most of Patna. And I do think we spent lots of amount of time, and I do believe that our 3 slums are a representative cross-section. I think we very extensively, and there is some work vis-a-vis the statistics. You can get statistics about Patna divided by ward. But of course, every census, the number of wards changes, and their boundaries change, and there's very few maps around. So we've actually had to go and uncover maps and start sort of trying to determine ourselves what ward number, say ward number 2 in 1991, what did it correspond to in 2001? And it's certainly not ward 2, for example. I think, as Peter said, we are not studying crime. We're studying violence and conflict. And I think we're quite careful in differentiating them too. By the way, this paper that everybody's talking about is a 6-page executive summary of an 82-page paper. So, you know, if if things are sort of slightly unclear, it's by virtue of having to actually bring them down. But I think, we are very careful to distinguish between conflict, which do not necessarily lead to violence all the time, and some which do. And crime, as Peter said, is a form of violence, but it is not all violence is crime. Having said that, I don't agree that we should necessarily be separating crime from social conflict. Violence is a continuum. And I think one of the worst things that's happened in social studies in the past 20 years is this tendency to separate between social, economic, and political crime. It's kind of very much kind of segregates and kind of creates compartments out of which you can't really start seeing the connections. I mean, I think there are connections between conflicts and violence over access to water and caste violence and political violence. I mean, we know these are all connected, and I think if we start trying to sort of really segregate them like that, we won't actually manage to really understand them. Where I do definitely come with you is on your conclusion that, the ones who are really committing the crimes in Patna are the rich and the elite, or those who control the state and are creating an exclusionary city. But that, they're not alone in that. There's a lot of people do that. Then that's where you kind of talk about more structural things. Finally, on the issue of domestic violence and whether it's better registration, no, in a nutshell. I mean, the Shirashri Dasgupta 2 years ago wrote an article on the Bihar economic miracle, in which there was a section on crime, where she argued that there was a rise of domestic violence and violence against scheduled caste in Bihar. However, the statistics are ludicrous. I mean, the official statistics say that the number of rapes in Bihar have increased from 27 for the whole of Bihar in 2003 to 60 for the whole of Bihar in 2009. Now, that can be read as a 50 and a bit increase, but, there are definitely more than 27, there were definitely more than 27, certainly more than 60 rapes in Bihar in 2009. So I think so in that sense, this is where there are limitations to the statistics, and where I come back to the importance of the qualitative information, and the kind of people's lived experience at the bottom line is what we want to be getting at. And if you want to change situations, you want people's perceptions and understandings of their own experience to change. And I think I'll leave it at that.
This now, all the panelists for excellent points that they have made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There is tea break for 15 minutes. Please join for the second session, followed by dinner.
No, I think that's 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent.
It's nice if I meet you.
I would like to read more detail.
Yeah, no, we'll send it to you as soon as we. Thank you. Well done. Thank you. I ask people to take their seats, and for the chair, Dr. P.K. Mohanty, to please come up to the panel and call in the panelists. And sorry.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, the PowerPoint projector doesn't seem to work. But on the other hand, the 6-page executive summary has got the policy recommendations. And this session is actually to try and talk about the policy recommendations of the project in order to get some feedback and to, yeah. Right. This session will be a bit shorter than the previous one, and it's aimed at, first of all, going through the policy recommendations that Shivani and myself have come up with by relating them directly to specific findings. And then the idea is to receive some feedback from a very eminent panel that we have, chaired by Dr. P.K. Mohanty, who's the Additional Director of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. Sorry? Regional Secretary. Additional Secretary, sorry. It says Additional Director here. We also have Ms. Madhu Purnima Keshwar, who is a Senior Fellow in the Center for the Study of Developing Societies here in New Delhi. Ms. Pamela Philippose, Director and Editor-in-Chief of Women's Feature Service in New Delhi. We have Dr. Chetan Vaidya, who's the Director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs in New Delhi. Dr. K.S. Subramanian, who is Senior Fellow in the Council for Social Development in New Delhi and formerly of the Indian Police Service. And we also have Mr. Dunu Roy, who's the Executive Director of the Hazard Center in New Delhi. He's not here. He will come, though. Now, okay, well, might as well just close it down. So if you have a look on the executive summary document, you'll see that we came up with a series of 6, which are in fact 7 different policy recommendations, because one of them has been divided in 2. Now, we've ranked them effectively in order of both how we feel that from more minor to more micro initiatives to more macro and broader structural initiatives. And we've also effectively ranked them according to cost and the likelihood that they might be implemented from a political perspective. Because it's all very well to be suggesting policies, and one can always come up with all sorts of wonderful policies, but it's quite important to come up with policies that are potentially practical and might actually have a chance of being implemented. Now, the first one might seem a little bit odd in view of the fact that we haven't actually mentioned this in our talk, but the first one is to institutionalize access to hand pumps in police stations for slum-dwelling women. One of the interesting findings during our studies was that police stations were opening up access to their hand pumps for slum-dwelling women in order to allow them to sort of get water in a safe environment. Many women in slums were complaining that at public water points, bathing, they were at risk of being eve-teased, and also that conflict because of a single water pump could lead to violence. And police stations, and this was 2 police stations, the Buddha Colony police station and the Mal Salami police station, were basically allowing local slum-dwelling women to come and take the water. Now, this worked very well in the Buddha Colony slum, which was located directly opposite the police station. It worked a little bit less well in the Mal Salami jurisdiction with the Mansurganj Musa Hartoli slum, which was over a kilometer away from the Tana. So in that sense, it's a kind of policy which has perhaps limited application, but certainly for the slums which are surrounding a police station, it could potentially be very important. Women were universally appreciative of this initiative and saw it as something positive. And one of the very interesting elements, which is also why we have some very positive comments to say about Patna Police, is that no woman actually said that they felt at risk or felt fearful going to the police station and bathing there. Now, it would seem to us a very low-cost policy to put in place to generalize to all the Tanas in Patna. And if this can be done, it would only require, presumably, a directive from the senior police chief, and this would be a very easy, low-cost initiative. The next initiative that we have, the next policy recommendation, relates to the fact that alcohol sales and production have increased in the slums since 2005, according to the people we talked to. We're not proposing banning alcohol or prohibition. We know that this doesn't work. There's plenty of historical examples around the world which show that it's not a policy that works. But we do think that one could regulate illegal alcohol production and sales perhaps better. This might also improve the quality, lead on the one hand to say less deaths through bad alcohol. But I think the more interesting and more important initiative might be to increase tariffs on alcohol. Now this is where one has to sort of go in for certain types of analyses which try and find the point of optimal trade-off. You raise tariffs too high and it will foster illegal and informal production, and but if you keep them too low, then you won't necessarily achieve the effect of reducing consumption. And this is actually a policy, the idea of making alcohol more expensive was a policy that was mentioned by local slum dwellers, women vis-a-vis men. Now, in terms of the transaction costs, although it would affect government revenue if alcohol sales went down, if you increase the price, you can probably compensate. So it's just a question of finding the optimal kind of trade-off point. Now, what was very interesting is that in November 2011, Nitish Kumar actually declared his intent that Bihar observe a Prohibition Day every 26th of November in order to highlight the social ills associated with alcohol consumption, and that he pledged the government to intentionally raise the price of liquor so that poor people who barely have money to feed their family do not blow their income on alcoholic drinks, to quote him. Now, with this kind of pronouncement in view, we are assuming that there is a high possibility that this kind of policy could possibly be fostered and promoted in a way that could be taken into account. One of the other findings of our study was that women, and this relates to the issue of whether or not women are reporting more instances of domestic violence. We did not have the impression that they were reporting more instances of domestic violence, and this was partly because they all complained that there were no women officers in the local police stations. Although formally by law, police stations in Patna do have to have one women's officer, in the 4 slums that we worked in, at any rate, the local police station did not have any women officers. Now, we've been told that there is a central women's police station in Patna, but of course, poor women in slums don't have either the time or the money necessarily to transport over to this central station in order to make complaints. Now, the obvious solution would be to ensure and enforce that there be a women's officer in every police station. But this is quite expensive, clearly. It would also require going against police organizational culture, you could suspect. So we've suggested another idea, which is to put together mobile women's officer units, which would visit slums on a rotating basis, and perhaps once a month actually provide for a couple of hours, be present in a slum in order to give women the opportunity to just talk, register, charge, ask for information. And the idea of having helplines and phoning did not seem to us to be necessarily useful. It wasn't the be-all. It was perhaps part of the solution, but a lot of women would say that, if you phone, then you still have to go to the Tanai in order to register your complaint. So perhaps a way would be to actually link in the possibility of phoning in a helpline and booking an appointment with a mobile women's unit during the next visit. The next 2 policies, which we've grouped under the single heading of infrastructural improvements, draw directly on the observations we made about the way in which everyday infrastructural conflicts can lead to sort of more deeper fault lines of conflict. So the way in which conflict over access to water or toilet often polarized rapidly in terms of caste and communal conflict, which had the potential to breaking out into violence which would spill over to the rest of the city. Now, at one level, it's very simple. Build more toilets and build more water access pumps. On the other hand, it was also very clear in talking with people that there were 2 major problems. One is that often something would be built and there was no maintenance, there was no monitoring of whether it continued to function, and therefore people were saying, well, you know, if you build something, some mechanism has to be put in place in order to make sure that it's kept in place and that it continues functioning. Now, there's all sorts of different ways in which this could be done, and in conversations, people have talked about public-private partnerships, perhaps. Other people have talked about just allowing the private sector to deal with the maintenance, because of course it's an expensive thing to do. I mean, it's in fact not that expensive to build a toilet and a water pump. It's much more expensive to have a regular monitoring of it. The other issue, which was often brought up by slum dwellers whom we talked with, was the capture of particular, say, water pump services or toilets. I talked about this public well, which had been captured by a particular OBC2 family and did not let the scheduled caste in the community use it. Now, this is something which, of course, is quite difficult to prevent. And once again, we need to think about creative solutions through which one might be able to ensure that public goods remain public. So, and this is the sense we've put, the costs here are quite high. We've suggested that the likelihood of it being implemented from a political perspective is quite possible, mainly because building water pumps and building toilets is something which appeals enormously to NGOs and particularly Western NGOs who kind of come in and sort of build a toilet and then sort of advertise that they've built 19 toilets in a slum and then go off and never come back again. Perhaps a way to do that would be to sort of have a division of labor, to have some people build the toilets and other institutions then kind of make sure that they function and are not captured. The next policy recommendation is actually, we're getting into more structural issues, and this is about trying to foster more inclusive city planning practices, city-wide planning practices. Now here, this is something which, in conversation with Shivani, as we were talking about this, I started thinking a lot about some of the work I've done in Latin America around participatory planning and budgeting. Now, if one can introduce more participatory planning processes within local communities, these are often very interesting ways through which local communities can take control of the planning, the deciding on infrastructure within the community. It's also a learning by doing. You practice kind of actually civic duties, democracy, all sorts of, there's all sorts of kind of multiplier effects to the introduction of participatory planning processes. It's, however, not easy. This is actually complicated and it requires a number of things. In the first place, it requires, say, the building of a space, say, a community hall, where people can actually gather and use together. I mean, it's one thing to do, say, focus group discussions on street corners or in an area in front of a hut, but if you want to bring together representatives from all the community, you need a bigger space, and you need something which is identifiable as the community's space. It also requires a certain amount of civic training. Political culture is something very hard to sort of overcome, particularly patron-client relationships or processes of what Chatterjee calls political citizenship, for example. And perhaps most importantly of all, it requires a devolution of authority by the state. The state has to agree to actually giving up some of its prerogatives to local communities. But at the same time, this is a balancing act, because local participatory processes can never be the be-all and end-all. A city is a system which goes beyond the local community, and one needs to find mechanisms through which to balance both the systemic needs of a city and the local community needs. But I think this is where, turning to examples, say in Brazil, particularly Porto Alegre or Curitiba, are very useful and potentially interesting examples to inspire, not necessarily to apply, since I don't believe you can really be transplanting kind of wholesale blueprint development here, but certainly I think some of the experiences there could be usefully studied with a kind of view to sort of thinking about them in Patna. The last two policy recommendations are probably rather utopian. The first one is that violence reduction in Patna should not be based on containment, but rather be based more on inclusive forms of prevention of violence. The problem, of course, here is that containment has been quite effective in Patna. as far as to our minds, in the sense that it has brought generalized levels of violence in the city down and has spatially concentrated violence in the slums. The people who decide on these policies are the ones who have benefited from that. They're the ones who are kind of the elite or the upper class, the government class, who now definitely feel that Patna is a safer and easier city to live in. So in that sense, the costs of that would be very high. It's something which is difficult to sort of put in place. It would require changing also police practices, although I think there's evidence in our study that police practices have begun to change in Patna compared to the 1990s. And ultimately, I think it is unlikely because it is a question of political economy. It is a question of deciding what, it's a question of a social class or a political class accepting that it has to sort of take into account the rest of society. And that's the last policy point is that we feel that there's a need to regularize, enforce, and protect land tenure and ownership rights in the city. Now, one of the interesting things about slums in Patna is that almost half of them are actually on government land. And there's often, and those which are on private land often actually are systems where you have people who are paying rent. So in that sense, there are already some kind of land right and land contract agreements in place in private areas. It's more in the government areas where there's a kind of grey area. And we see that where there are encroachment by private developers, where they might collude with the PMC in terms of allowing private developers to get on government land. However, the whole idea of regularizing land tenure in Patna is one which is really fraught. Of course, it's once again, it's a redistributive issue. And doing that in the middle of a city which is experiencing a kind of infernal construction boom and where land prices are going up massively seems also very utopian to expect that the government might consider putting that in place. So that's the kind of policy issues that we've come up with and we think are worth debating and putting forward. And what we would hope is to have some feedback on this, whether people think they are interesting, feasible ideas, whether they think we've missed something completely, and how one might go about thinking about alternative policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would request the panelists, would Shivani would like to add or at this point? Okay. So we would like to request Madhuji to...
Let me come later.
Acha, you will come later. Then I would ask... you will start from Chetan.
Okay, there are I think 7 points, and I will focus on 4A, 4B, and 6. The improvement in services, and I think Dr. P.K. Monti is in a better position to speak on this, but because I'm speaking first, I'll see. There is a national program on JNURM on slum improvement, and now there is a program on RAY, which talks about a city-wide slum improvement program. We call it slum-free cities, and also which has a inbuilt mechanism for providing land rights, I mean property rights in that sense, and also improved services, and all this will happen only if there is city-wide inclusive city-wide planning. I am a planner myself, an architect planner, and I think one of the first things which master plan does is takes away access of poor to land, I think service land, and I think that is more, and we all of us, Dr. Monti has been talking about it and has been supporting studies on this, that we need to have a kind of master planning which provides city-wide, and now with RAY this is possible, and that is first step. Similarly, provision of services is part of this. There is funding available, and that should be accessed. It would mean preparing the appropriate kind of city-wide plan as well as detailed project reports, agreeing to implement some reforms. I was with you in Patna recently, and we realized that the reform agenda even what is now included in the, has not been completed by Bihar in Patna. At the same time, Dr. Monti, they have completed all the indicators for 13 Finance Commission, which is very positive. State government has done what it has to do under 13 Finance Commission, but at the city level, I think those efforts are required. So I would say there are programs and they should make full use of it. And I feel one of the limitations of Patna and or Bihar would be capacity of the municipal staff, capacity also at the state government level, and even in the private sector. And that is one area which needs to be looked at. That is something which under DFID project efforts have been made to strengthen both local government as well as state government in this area, but still a lot of efforts are required. Thank you.
From left, I will go to the right. I would request Dr. Subramaniam.
Chair, we've had a very conscientious study conducted by a very eminent group of scholars, and I have listened to the discussion in the morning, the whole day today, in the afternoon. Very useful discussions, very penetrating comments and suggestions have been made. I accept most of them. But I'm not an expert on Bihar. I've done some work on Bihar. When I was in the Home Ministry, I was longest serving director of the Research and Policy Division. We did some work on Bihar, which throws some light on the challenges when it comes to implementation of the recommendations made by various groups. We've had many groups in the Home Ministry, dealing with policy issues on conflict and violence. The first report was written by the Research and Policy Division, 1969. It was called Causes and Nature of Agrarian Tensions. We worked on agrarian tensions. We don't divide violence into urban violence, rural violence. That's a kind of academic approach which the ministry does not follow. Ministry says violence is violence. You deal with violence wherever it occurs, whenever it occurs. Give policy recommendations and suggestions to the state governments. Our job is to do that. My work has been mainly in the government of India, also in the governments in northeast of India. There are conflicts of various kinds going on in the northeast, and we haven't had constructive studies of the kind that you have done in the context of Bihar and Patna. But what I feel is, when we went to Bihar in 1982, the present Prime Minister was then the Member Secretary Planning Commission. And there was a series of incidents of violence in Bihar, in the central district. That is, in those days it used to be Patna district, now it is Jahanabad district. In this Jahanabad district, 6 development blocks were seriously affected by agrarian violence. And a large number of people were shot dead in police encounters. So the question arose, even about basic information on what really happened on the ground is lacking in the ministry. I am arguing, in a recent paper I have submitted, I am arguing there is a major information crisis in the government of India and the Home Ministry. Sorry, you must pardon me if I am not going to talk about your policy recommendations, which I accept fully. And I suggest that you give it to the government of India and also to the state government of Bihar for consideration. What they will do is probably to set up a group to go into your recommendations and pass it on to the different departments concerned. There are a series of recommendations. These recommendations have to be passed down to the departments. The same thing will happen in Government of India. If you send your study to the Prime Minister of India, he will mark it to his Cabinet Secretary, and the Cabinet Secretary will send it to somebody. In this case, you call it violence. His study is focused on violence, then the Home Ministry will come into the picture in a big way. And therefore, the Home Ministry's role in dealing with violence is what should concern people like me and also people like you. So when we went to Bihar, the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, was deeply concerned about what happened in the central districts of Bihar. So she sent a study team headed by Dr. Manmohan Singh to go to Bihar. I was a member of the study team from the Home Ministry. We had a joint secretary at that time, Mr. P.S. Krishnan, who was dealing with scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, scheduled castes mainly. He was a member. Then we had a member from Ministry of Rural Development, then another member from the Planning Commission, and from the Central Statistical Department, one member. All of us went to Bihar. We met the district magistrate and the police chief of the district. When we landed in the office of the district magistrate and the SP were present. They were about to receive us, and district magistrate was putting on a bush shirt with no button at the top. He was putting his chest out. We said, why is he so proud and looking arrogant? His main point was that he had maintained order at any cost. There was a lot of rural violence. There was a lot of number of people were killed. The district magistrate was proud of what he had done, and the SP was standing next to him. So we told him that we have not come here to appreciate your good work for maintaining law and order. We want to know what is the kind of development work that you are doing. Immediately the mood of the district magistrate became very modest. And he said, sir, we are trying to do our best. Things are not reaching the public. That sort of feedback came to us. So we were really concerned that whatever guidelines are issued by the government, whatever recommendations are passed on to the state government, they are not being effectively followed up. That is the major problem in the government of India. And I'm sure if you go and talk to the district officers and the state level officers, they would have their own concerns and problems. So in Bihar, we did not know how many people had been killed in police encounters. The state police was saying 12 people killed, all Naxalites. Central police, the intelligence bureau is saying 12 people killed, all Naxalites. But the press is giving a totally different picture. So we decided to call the chief secretary of the state to Delhi, Home Ministry, for a discussion. And the chief secretary came and said about the number of people dead. He said 59 people were killed, not one of them was a Naxalite. See the kind of information crisis that dominates, central government and the state government. When we went to Bihar, we came back, we wrote a report. So a series of recommendations were made, just as you are making, the very same sort of report were prepared by us. Not only by us, but people from the other ministries and departments were also there. But nothing happened. We do not know what happened. We said, very often it happens that you send a report to the state government doesn't even open the envelope in which the report is made. In Tamil Nadu, for example, we had a report on violence against scheduled castes. We sent it to the chief minister. Our home minister wrote a report, and the chief minister did not even open the envelope for 3 months. What sort of policy making, what sort of recommendations can be implemented in India? I have serious doubts. I have just returned from Tamil Nadu. There was a series of violent incidents against scheduled castes. The main perpetrators of the offences were the police. The police belong to the caste in which the chief minister has a deep interest. Chief minister, right-hand person, Sasikala, she belongs to the caste which is perpetrating violence against scheduled castes. And the chief minister has adopted a child belonging to her, this right-hand person. Therefore, violence is going on. Violence has to be stopped. There are serious officers doing serious work, but they are helpless. When I went to the districts in Tamil Nadu, I spoke to district magistrate, SP and others. They all know what the government of India wants them to do, but they are not doing it because they are working under the state government. State government does not want serious action on social justice issues. So that is one example of, how policy implementation is facing a number of obstacles. More recent example, the whole business of Naxalites, so-called Maoist violence in central districts, in central tribal belt. What is the cause of the violence? What is the nature of the violence? what remedial steps are to be taken, is something on which there is again an information crisis in the Home Ministry. The Home Ministry reads only IB reports, Intelligence Bureau reports. They don't follow. There was a huge report written by the Planning Commission. Mr. Yugandhar produced a long report on extreme development challenges in extremist affected areas. The report was not even referred to by the Home Minister when he held a conference of chief ministers, in which all the chief minister was present, Home Minister was present, the Prime Minister was present. Prime Minister was simply repeating the IB report. He was saying Naxalite movement is the greatest internal security threat to India. It is not a developmental threat for him. It is an internal security threat. So there is a problem of, there is a major crisis of policy making and policy implementation in India, which affects not just the central government, but also the state government and the local government. Now, the third example I want to give is administrative reform is a very big issue. The previous government, UPA 1 government, set up a second Administrative Reforms Commission. The Administrative Reforms Commission has submitted 15 reports. 15 reports have been submitted covering all aspects of governance, including rural development, public sector reform, and all sorts of recommendations, conflict resolution, terrorism, all these things are covered, police reforms, everything is there. But the reports are gathering dust. We had a meeting here some time ago to discuss police reforms, organized by the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. You know whom they invited? They invited not the Home Minister, but Kapil Sibal, who is not dealing with Home Ministry. Kapil Sibal comes and talks big and says, we don't believe in police reforms. Don't talk about police reforms, we don't want any change because the system as it is working should go on. So, I think the politicians are not serious about changing the system. Structural changes are a major issue. They are not being addressed seriously. We have Panchayati Raj institutions of local governance at the local level, block level and the district level. How are they functioning? Elections are going on, but serious problems of finances, serious problems of functions, serious problems of staff are going on. And decentralization is not taking place. Financial decentralization is not taking place except in some parts of the country like in Kerala or in Karnataka and to some extent West Bengal. So I think there is a major crisis of governance in the country. And there is an organic crisis. It's not just an ordinary crisis, it's a more organic crisis. So I feel that we need to debate these issues also when we are dealing with studies like this. This is a very good study, I think. Maybe one can be nitpicking and find a number of limitations in the study. Number of criticisms have been made. I think you defended yourself quite well too. But when it comes to implementation, what do? You will have to go to the Chief Minister. So for a long time we have been saying there should be, in Home Ministry at least, I have had the chance to work with some very eminent secretaries. At that time, our thinking was that when conflict situations are getting out of control in different parts of the country, whether in the northeast or in the central tribal belt or in Jammu and Kashmir and so on, we need interdisciplinary study come action groups. These should include not just scholars. Yours is a very scholarly study, but you need people from the social field, people like social activists have to participate in the study. You need civil servants also. So it has to be a composite team which goes into conflict situations and come up with recommendations which can be accepted by the government. They should have binding powers on the government. Government should have institutional arrangements for policy making at the government level. That's not there. When dealing with conflict in Home Ministry, there are no institutional mechanisms for policy making to how to deal with conflicts. We write reports and the whole bureaucratic machinery takes everything in an ad hoc manner. Amateurish, senior officers are quite amateurish and ad hoc. They can't do serious work, and the mechanisms are not in place. And you have a police machinery which has been recently described as a dangerous anachronism by a very well-established international human rights agency. So you have a system of working in the country which is raising a large number of questions. Therefore, I admire the kind of work that you're doing. I support your recommendations and so on. But I'm caught up in a crisis myself.
Why did you waste your time? That's what
Pardon?
I'm telling you.
Yeah. So there is a serious problem.
Shall we close the discussion on at this note and say what's the point?
No, I am only talking about based on my experience. You talk about your experience. I don't know what you can do. Whether you can intervene on the ground. Can you go to Patna and see that things which you want to do are being done? How will you do it? So there are serious problems. Thank you very much.
Madhuji would like to...
After Pamela, let me recover.
Basically, I was interested, in fact, in that point you raised about conflict and violence and when one slips into the other. And I'm going to try and look at it through the gender lens because I believe that women, in a sense, are affected by conflict and by violence, or vice versa. I would also like to draw your attention to a study that was done in a resettlement colony in Delhi. This was done by Jagori and the Women's in Cities International, and the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability was also involved. And basically they looked at the budgeting that went into infrastructure and so on. And they found that there was, of course, a huge difference between the amount of money that the government spent in the well-off, say, Green Park or one of the South Delhi colonies, and what they spent in terms of actually legal resettlement colonies. I mean, Bhavana and Balaswar and all these places are legal. They're not slums in that sense. So the government actually has to look at them with an equal gaze, but it hadn't. And they found that a mere 30 rupees was spent on water supply to this particular place, while 879 was spent per person in a South Delhi colony. So you see, even in terms of budget provisioning, what a huge gap remains. And looking at general budgeting, within that, sanitation, water, anyway, is